Praise the Lord, guys. I'm Straw Greenhorn. Now, when he had ended all these sayings in the audience of the people, he entered into Capernaum. Now, there was a certain centurion servant who was there unto him, who was sick, ready to die. When he heard of Jesus, he sent unto him the elders of the Jews, beseeching him that he would come and heal his servant. Now, when they came unto Jesus, they instantly besought him, saying that he was worthy for whom he should do this thing, for he loveth our nation and hath built us a synagogue. So, here the beginning of the 7th chapter of Luke. We open up with a story that, is one of the more popular stories. This is the one where, he's eventually going to say that, I'm not worthy, come under your roof, for you to come under my roof, but just say the word and the servant will be healed. So, these are one of the more popular ones. So, we see here, really Jesus' fame touching the whole, just atmosphere. Everybody knows about him at this point. He's reliable. His name has gotten around. I mean, when he has such a great tool to help others, what it benefits others so greatly because, him healing people, the Bible says that virtue goes out of him and heals them, right? So that if he's losing virtue, how is that benefiting him? So, so in a case like this, where it's such a great benefit unto the people, imagine being blind and then being able to see, or deaf and, able to hear, and all these other things, right? So, his name and his, ability is being mentioned with such urgency, that, is spreading like wildfire. So now here we have a centurion, being brought into the mix. Now we understand that these are the Romans. At this time, Israel was under Roman, control, right? They were dominant to them. So we see this Roman, the centurion, that means he's a high-ranking person, coming unto Jesus. Now they have their own faith, right? I did look up a little bit. It says that they were, I forget the word, but they believed in many gods, right? Some of the things that we know now, like Mercury, Venus, it's really idol worship that they adapted, from the Egyptians, the Medes and the Persians, all these, people. It seems as if it was more like a mixing palette of things. So no doubt being in a false religion, he doesn't see things like this. I would wonder, did he ever even, I'm pretty sure that he did, maybe consult his gods, but, having never seen them heal anyone, I don't think that was done with much expectation. But no, hearing of this Jesus of Nazareth, who has these, results, because it's not just one person that can come unto him. The whole, everybody's going to come unto him and tell him about Jesus, what he's doing and what he's able to do. So now, this man not being a Jew, right? We know the story of, was it the Syrophoenician woman? Her daughter, I believe, was sick or demon possessed. And he said, let the children first be filled, right? It is not meet to take the children's bread, cast to little dogs, because she was not of Israel. So this, centurion is obvious that he's not of Israel. But, we see, something being mentioned him, right? That would give him favor, how he, loveth the people. And why? Because he had built us a synagogue. So now understanding that, they were pretty much, in captivity to these Romans. And for this man to do something like this, to your to your slaves pretty much, even though it wasn't maybe as that bad to call them slaves. Remember when they were in Egypt, they were so hated, right? After Joseph died. After the savior who saved the land from the famine, who got Pharaoh 20%, increase of all the land, all the people, the deal that Joseph set up when they had run out of money, they ran out of their cattle, and they ran out of land. Pharaoh, he owned all. And as a result, he got 20% each year from the people. So when Joseph died now, then another Pharaoh took over that knew not him, and he put them under hard bondage, right? They were like hard slaves. We don't really see them, anybody giving them this kind of favor, to love them, to support, their God. How can we respect your God when you are slaves to us? Our God must be better, right? So, it's an unusual love that this man, he shows. And he does love them, to build them this synagogue. It's not really told how he came to have this kind of heart, Maybe it was God's will. Maybe God, called him, brought him close for whatever reason. Maybe it was by accident, who knows? But we see him having a heart for the children of Israel, right? And that's a great show of character, right? They say that, real character is shown by how you treat those that you don't need. And, they were, under his, authority. And for him to invest, because, I doubt, a synagogue, that can't be cheap, right? So, just look into the heart of this man, how bountiful it is unto somebody who he's supposed to be, looking down to, keeping them in check. He's supposed to be watching them, making sure that they don't lose their place, they don't try and, overthrow him. But, he's showing a different heart, to these people. So, they bring this, unto Jesus as the reason to why, this is why he's worthy. And, the reason was true. They came with a true reason. But we know that, people can call people worthy for other reasons, just because they're rich, who's their father or mother, their family history or name, the whatever land that they might own or connections they have, because they could have came to him with a bad reason, right? So we see them, judging who is worthy, even though they got it right. But that's something you can also talk about, and how most of the time who men call worthy, God does not call worthy, right? So we see this, servant being sick, ready to die. And we know that, I always say that medicine in those days is not what it is today. They didn't have, x-rays, CT scans, MRIs. They didn't have, CBC, blood tests, CBC, WBC, platelets, certain, inflammation markers, liver enzymes, all these things. They didn't have the fancy diagnoses that we can, name today. If they did have one that was close, what we have today, we can take that one thing and divide it into like 10, 20, diagnoses within that group where they can only call it one thing. But, no doubt, having seen many die before, observing that process, there was something about it that made them understand that he was close to the point of death. It doesn't say how long he was sick or give any, indications what might have caused it. They didn't give the symptoms. Was he feverish? Was he, did he have some growth on him? How did the skin look? The eyes look? They didn't really describe how, they just said that he was sick. Now they didn't even tell, his nation. Was he also a Jew, or was he, was he a Roman? Because we know that they would often take Jews, for their servants, like this. But something is mentioned here about how much he loved him. So many things can be said about this centurion. You kind of get the sense that he treated him like family. He wasn't just a paid servant. Obey what I say. Don't lose your place. Have everything ready as I tell you. Don't talk back. Do whatever I say. We don't get that kind of stern, relationship. And here he is sending for help for him when he could have just, had him in bed and looking at him, giving him sorrow eyes, speaking quietly, softly unto him, waiting for him to pass. We see him, actively seeking, help, being proactive in seeking, his care. So we see that, he heard of Jesus. Word is spreading so fast. Have you heard about this guy? He's able to raise the dead, open the eyes of the blind. He, is able to cause the dumb to speak, the deaf to hear. He's able to cast out devils. Now, we don't know what your guy might have, but, more than likely from what we've seen of him, he might, and he should be able to do something, because so far we've just seen diseases where, nobody's really dying, so far in this chapter. And, with each thing that he does, he shows them limits of his power, or the limitlessness, of his power. And I'm sure that they're asking the question, is there a limit as to what he's able to do? Is there a limit as to what he's able to heal? They're asking this question, right? Subconsciously, because they're looking to see, okay, so, one day they might bring somebody onto him and he might try to heal him and he's unable to, right? They're still, subconsciously, evaluating for this possibility. It's not that they're hating on him or, trying to be negative somehow. But, it's just, a natural question that anyone could ask. I guess, I want to compare it to like free money. Imagine if somebody was just there giving out free money, right? I mean, you would get as much as you could. And then when you had, not room enough, you would tell people, and, they come on, they would come understanding that, it's completely to their benefit. It's not costing you anything and you're getting such a great gain. We saw that when he went to Nazareth first, he rebuked them, they were upset, he just came with, preaching, and they didn't quite receive it so well. They wanted to throw him headfirst off the cliff, right? But then, the next place, which was Capernaum, which is also this city. So he's coming back to Capernaum. We saw him heal the man with the unclean spirit. Then he heals Simon Peter's, wife's mother of the fever. Then, when the sun was setting, they brought unto him all that had sick with diverse diseases, and he healed them all. So this is his second time to Capernaum. So does this centurion live in Capernaum? You could ask that question. Or does he live close by? Because, from what he did the first time, remember, he healed all of them, right? So, word, one tells one. And they're talking about it, so heavily that, word gets to this centurion. And, we see him sending the elders of the Jews. So, he humbled himself, with that move, I would say. going through their channels and not exerting his power, being a centurion, addressing, coming onto Jesus, trying to impress him with his rank. And maybe that was a smart move because, just like he told that lady, first let the children be filled, and that was her daughter, right? And that was a child, right? So this is not even your child, and it's a grown person. Maybe going this route, got him a quicker yes than the other way would have. So I'm seeing nothing but good things about this guy. He's so humble, he's so caring, he's so generous and thoughtful. All right, so here in the seventh chapter of Luke, if we do a quick recap of chapter 6, we saw it open up where it was on the Sabbath. They walked through the cornfields, they ate the corn. Scribes and Pharisees complained. Jesus, he gave them the story about how David ate the showbread and his men, which only priests should eat, telling them that he is Lord of the Sabbath. Then we see on another Sabbath, as he was teaching in the synagogue, there was a man with a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, right? So then when he did, they were filled with madness. Then we saw him withdraw in the mountain to pray. Then when he came down, he called his disciples, he picked the 12 apostles. Then he started with all these parables, these one-liners. Blessed be ye poor, yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you which hunger, for you shall be filled. Blessed are you which weep, for you shall laugh. Woe unto you rich, you have received your consolation. Woe unto you when all men speak well of you, for even so they did the false prophets. Love your enemies, do good to them that hate you. Bless them that curse you, pray for them which despitefully use you. Turn in the other cheek. Forget, if he takes your cloak, let him have the coat also. Give unto all men. Him that take it away that goods ask them not again. Do unto men as you had them do unto you. If you love those that love you. If you do good to those that do good to you. If you lend unto those of whom you hope to receive again. What thanks have ye? But, love your enemies, do good and lend. Be perfect even as your heavenly Father is, merciful. Judge not, condemn not, and forgive, so that you may not be judged, condemned, and that you may be forgiven. With whatsoever measurement you meet, it shall be measured to you again. Can the blind lead the blind? Shall they not both fall into the ditch? The servant is not above his master, where he that is perfect shall be as his master. Why beholdest the mote that is in thy brother's eyes, but not the beam that is in thine own? A good tree can't bring forth corrupt fruit. A corrupt tree cannot bring forth good fruit. Every tree is known by its fruit. Man, do not gather of thorns figs, or of a bramble bush grapes. A good man from the good treasures of his heart bring forth that which is good. Out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaketh. Why call ye me Lord, Lord, doing not what I say? He that cometh unto me heareth my words and keepeth them is like unto the man which built his house upon the rock. For the floods neither the streams could, beat it. It stood and it was not shaken, for it was founded upon the rock. All right, so then, here's chapter 7 of the book of Luke. Where it started out saying, and when he had ended all his sayings in the audience of the people, he entered into Capernaum. So now he just, gave them all these, one-liners, these parables. I just gave a quick recap of all of them. But in the audience of the people, so like I said, he just, went up into the mountain to pray. Then he named the 12 disciples, casting out, clean spirits. And that's when the people, they pressed upon him to touch him. Virtue went out of him and healed them all. Then he looked up upon when he beheld the disciples, he began to have compassion, and then, these things, he, it put him in a mood where he started saying all these things. So when he had finished these sayings, then, he entered into Capernaum. So these sayings, like I said, they really, show, a hard and counterintuitive, unexpected, way of how things actually work. I think that because, like I said, one time before, there's a delay, but sometimes between cause and effect. And sometimes, because it's not, physical enough. I said, if you put your hand on a hot stove, you feel the heat, so you pull it off. But some of these things, when you do them, you don't see that you're causing these effects. And there's blind spots, right? There's pride, where you will look at the very thing, because you believe that you are special, or that you are above these things. You believe that, because of your wealth or your name or your reputation or whatever, you can list. You can look at the very cause and effect, pride, and just stick your nose up. And like I said, there's blind spots where, it's like every time you're supposed to see it, you look right through it or over it. They say that the mind cannot see what the brain doesn't know. I think that thinking really, and even reality, is really a calculation of your brain. It's taking all your wisdom, all your knowledge and insight, and it's running such a hard calculation when you even open your eyes and look around. Because it's making, your brain is making sense of all these things that you see. It's comparing it to the things that you saw in the past. It's using your knowledge and information to analyze what they are, what they mean, what they could lead to. When you look at your environment, I think that the brain, it works over time, right? And for and if you don't have, like I said, the eyes can't see, what the brain doesn't know. Not having a language to decode this particular thing, and that's kind of like close to a blind spot where you don't even see the thing. And there's projection also, or what you expect. How there can be a hole, in the atmosphere, and then you project what you believe and what you think to cover the hole. This process, it happens so quick, right? It happens so quick and it's so automatic that sometimes, you'd even think that it's somebody telling it to you and not that, it's your observation. It's somebody telling it to you and it's a trusted source. It's so automated. And that's what self-help is. It's getting all the tools to, isolate these things and apart and study them. You ever seen like a chop shop where they take cars, how they strip them down to the engine, the transmission, every part. They take the doors off, the windshield out, they take the seats out, everything is completely removed and they sell them piece by piece. Self-help, it gives you the tools to take your own brain apart like that and study it and, understand yourself, understand the good processes you have, the bad processes that you have, right? Some things you can keep, but some things you need to change. Not everything is going to be bad, not everything is going to be good. So he's giving them these hard truths where, you could follow these things blindly and you would be okay. The source is credible, right? Not every source is going to be credible. Some sources you have no business listening to, right? And like I said, he's returning to Capernaum. He just left. The first time he was there, he left, Nazareth, where they kicked him out when he rebuked them. He told those two stories about, Elijah and Elisha, how there were many widows, but none of them were helped from Israel in the days of Elijah. And there were many lepers in Israel, but none of them were cleansed. Only Naaman, which was also a non-Israel. Two non-Israel people being helped when God is so powerful, and they got really angry. They wanted to throw him head first off the cliff. So he changed his approach in Capernaum, leading with the casting out of this devil of this man that's cried out with a loud voice. So showing them results instead of just theory. So this got him some fame there. Like I said, when the sun was setting, they brought unto him all that were sick or had any diseases or unclean spirits, and he healed all of them. So he left with on a pretty high note. And after having demonstrated these things, when he comes back, so no doubt he's gonna be so heavily anticipated, returning to this place. All right, so the next one says, now there was a certain centurion's servant who was there unto him, who was sick, ready to die. So now this man, centurion, is Roman, who were over the Jews at the time. I spoke about how the publicans, they were Jews, but they worked for the Romans collecting taxes. So the Jews were paying taxes to the Romans. So that they were under their tribute, right? So now this high-ranking military guy, the centurion, that's military. So now his servant is being mentioned, and who was there unto him. So now he had an emotional attachment in this thing. It wasn't just that he heard of the power of Jesus, Jesus being a Jew who was also under his jurisdiction, then coming to use his authority to squeeze out a healing from Jesus. We get the sense that this guy, like I said, for all the things that we've seen, written of him, that he's a stand-up guy, as they say. It's a good guy, right? We see his humility, we see his generosity. We don't get the sense that he's one of those hoarders, like, I'm just hoarding my riches just to get richer. The Bible spoke about that parable of the man whose ground brought forth plentiful in 1 year. He didn't even have rooms, to store it. He said, I will tear down these barns and I will build bigger barns, and I will eat and drink and be many, for I have many substances for many years. God said, thou fool, you don't know that, this very night your soul shall be required of thee. Being said that he was, rich but not rich towards God. So, this guy here, being this, centurion, we see his compassion for his servant, being dear unto him. So you see that this guy, he looks at riches. His riches, are the people. He has wealth, and power and status. He built them a synagogue. Now look at him taking care of his servant. His riches is the people, right? So he was, sick, ready to die. Now, like I said, not much detail is given about his sickness. No symptoms are given, but we understand that he's in such a state that he's not really much, used to himself. He might be just bedridden, might be unable to talk. He might be, like almost, unconscious state. But none of his symptoms are given. Like I said, no fever, headaches, skin changes, cough. Is he bleeding? Is he bleeding up? Any hardness, any tumors on him? But having observed, no doubt, the point of death many times, they can see that he's close. So he was sick, ready to die. Meaning that they had began to call it almost, expecting the funeral. He probably got his house in order, as they like to say in the Bible. Paid off his debts, whatever he could, made his arrangements. Set up his family if he had any. Maybe even they started looking for his replacement, whatever job he had. So he was on the way out. So the next verse says, "But when he heard of Jesus, he sent unto him the elders of the Jews, beseeching him that he would come and heal his servant." So it's not said if somebody came unto him directly and told him about Jesus, or he just overheard all the things, the healings, the miracles, the casting out devils, everything that he was doing, even the catch of the fishes, in the boat. Did he pick it out from hearing them, or from overhearing them talk? Did somebody come unto him? Because it said that when he heard of him, right? So now, this piqued his curiosity, a solution, and no doubt Jesus had the credibility. And at the same time, what's the worst could happen, right? If he's able to heal him, then great. And if not, then he's gonna die anyways, right? So when he heard of Jesus, he sent unto him the elders of the Jews. So now he's sending unto him, the elders, because they have rank, right? We know that Jesus, he's a preacher. He started out as a carpenter, now he's a preacher. So, he would assume that they have some affiliation with him, which is so not the case, right? Because, we already see them watching him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath. The man with the withered hand, the Pharisees are already watching them eat the corn on the Sabbath, and we know all the things that they would accuse him of. When they held the council, it was the chief priests, elders, and scribes, and the high priest that brought him into the palace of the high priest and then condemned him to death. So he's going through this route because of the religious connection, but they really have no connection with Jesus, right? But him thinking logically, so he went this way. And like I said, he humbled himself. He didn't call him directly, saying, "Come unto me, the centurion, who is over you," beseeching him that he would come and heal his servant. So this beseeching thing, like I said, is it's more like a begging almost. It's asking, really, from the point of understanding that you're really asking for a favor. You're asking somebody to help you and not commanding them. Not saying that, you're entitled to receive it or you deserve it, but it's like appealing to somebody's emotion. So, this man of war, this centurion, is beseeching Jesus, that he would come and heal his servant. So the next verse says, "So when they came unto Jesus, they instantly, besought him, saying that he was worthy for whom he should do this." So now, when they come, they instantly, beseech him. Why? Because of the tension, I guess, them being their, subject unto these Romans. Why would we do anything for them, right? So, this beseeching is really, assuming that and really predicting that he would say no, according to what they can reason. So, they led with this, social, attribute, the social situation that he had, between them, letting him know that, it's not like that, how you would expect, our relationship with a Roman to be. I could ask the question, where were guys like these, when he was being crucified? Pontius Pilate was a governor, right? And that was under the Romans. Where were guys like these, who has power, to speak up, because, after they condemned him in the palace of the high priest, they dropped him off to the government. Pontius Pilate is the government and not the faith. We see a separation of church and state. So they condemned him in the church and then dropped him off to the state for them to execute him. So no, he was completely under their care. Where were guys like these, right? So they besought him, let him know that he is worthy, that and like I said, they could have come with a wrong reason of worthy, saying that, well, it's because he's a centurion. He has the power and authority for to us, and we have to do it. When Naaman the Syrian, who, he just rebuked them in Nazareth before he came to Capernaum the first time, when he sent unto the king, of Syria, this king of Syria sent unto the king of Israel, saying to heal Naaman. And the king of Israel was worried, saying, what if I'm unable to do it? Is he going to take my head? So we see, these elders, showing such kind of two different faces. I don't want to say two-faced. I want to say two different faces. How they're so ready to accuse him of all these things. But then they're coming onto him now, relying on his power to heal, to deliver, to recover, to set free. So then, they're going to come and do this. And then next time we see them, they're going to be at his throat. So they're showing two different faces, I'm not going to call them two-faced, but I'm saying that they're showing two different faces. All right, so the last one says, "For he loveth our nation and hath built us a synagogue." So, they're mentioning, the love that he has for these people. no doubt being up amongst them and, seeming like the kind of guy that just, he connects with people. And, for whatever reason, he ended up this far to the point where he's building them, this synagogue. I don't think that that's, a cheap thing to build, but, is that the size is not mentioned. The splendor of how fancy it is not mentioned either. But, he doesn't sound like a guy that corners, right? And like I said, the authority that he's given over them and the control that he is expected to maintain, him having this compassion on them is an unusual thing to say. Because what usually happens when you show people compassion, they try to walk over you, right? They test your boundaries, try to, get away with stuff. So, compassion over somebody who you hold in tribute like this is not, a natural thing that we usually see. So no doubt, they got this one right. How, he does love the nation. For to do something like this, over people that you have, pretty much invaded, and you have taken control of their country. Anybody that we saw invading Israel when, they were doing all the idol worship and they got in trouble with God, they would put them to tribute. They would work for them, right? And they weren't kind unto them. Even in Egypt, they weren't kind unto them, when they became their slaves. So, this is going above and beyond, showing a heart of, absolute gold, I would say. I'm Straw Greenhorn.